everyone. Thanks for joining our guest speaker meeting today. We'll give a brief introduction of ourselves and then we'll be introducing our guest speaker. So I'm Casey Shu. I'm currently a freshman studying bioengineering, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-president of IAP.
Hello, my name is Emily. I am also the co-president, co-founder of IAP, and also a sophomore. And I will be introducing our lovely guest speaker, Joel Kouame. So he is a licensed psychotherapist with over 10 years of experience in the field. He has worked in the public sector of mental health for a significant portion of his career, where he has worked in management as well as provide clinical services as a social worker and a therapist. And now I will turn it over to Joel Kouame to speak.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? I do warn you guys, I do have a bit of a cold, so if my voice is a bit raspy or if I just cough infrequently during this, I just want you guys to know where that's coming from. All right, so I made oh, okay. So I made a little bit of a presentation. Is it possible for me to share it or?
Yes, let me see if I can make you the host or be able to share. 1 second. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen? Okay. So today I just want to kind of focus on these 7 questions, these 7 points rather, when we're talking about what mental health is, so we get a good idea of it. Um, I think to truly understand what mental health is and to truly understand what's the part that stress plays in our mental health, we have to kind of look at all 7 of these points in totality, and then we'll get that understanding. All right. As I go through these questions, by the way, I do want you to feel comfortable interrupting me when I reach the next section of questions. So if you guys have any question about the question that was former, we can go over it and do a deeper dive if necessary. So first question is, what is mental health? So a person's condition with regard to their psychological and emotional well-being, right? Now, the idea of understanding what our mental health is really understanding what our needs and wants are, right? You have to understand that when you're discussing the human psyche, it's a subjective creature, meaning that what one needs and what wants is largely going to be conditional based on the individual who needs and wants it, right? So we have to kind of look away from objective needs and wants and try to do a deep dive of what's our needs and wants. So, you know, if we're talking about everyone has the need to eat, right? We have to eat to survive, but what kind of diet are we going to have, right? Some people are vegan, some people have largely a meat-based diet, right? So it's really understanding what makes a person feel fulfilled in their lives, right, as individuals. So I want to break down 6 motivators to make this task a bit easier of understanding what our needs and wants are. When you think about our needs and wants, you have to see that our needs and wants fall under these 6 categories. Now, how these 6 are satisfied are different per person, right? So when we're looking at these 6 motivators, I don't want you to think that there's one way for all. Everybody has their own way of having these things satisfied, right? And this is going to play a big part in understanding our emotions and understanding our emotional well-beings. So we can start with value, right? When we think about value and we're understanding what value means, value is different for everybody. How we're validated, how we feel important in our lives, it's different per person. Some people can find value in what they do for work, right? So some people might be very boastful about what job they have or their salary or whatnot and so forth. Some people might find value in what they do for others, right? So some people might find value in being extremely empathetic, or they might find value in being very charitable, you know. So value is, again, it's subjective, but we all seek out value in different ways, right? And value shifts based on the systems that we inhabit. So finding value with your family versus finding value among your friends, finding value as a student versus finding value as an employee. All of these things are going to be different. Okay, does that make sense so far? The next thing that we're going to be looking at is the things that we assign value to, right? So we are looking to protect those things. So we can have a number of things that we've assigned value to, our cars, our grades, our families, our friendships, right? A desk, right? Maybe it's your favorite desk, your favorite couch, whatever it is. Whatever you've assigned value to, that's going to be what you look to protect. And how you protect those things is different. It's not always going to be a matter of me trying to protect it by, some jumping in the way of a speeding car, right? There are different things that we do. For example, when we're looking to protect our friendships, right? You might do that by spending time with your friends, sending text messages, sending emails, voice chats, different things like that, and doing it routinely, sending memes, sending, stories that you saw on Instagram, whatever it is. But you'll have routine behaviors that you would do in order to value those friendships. And that's how we seek to protect them, right? The next thing that we want is, and they're not in any particular order, but we kind of want all of these things. So one of the next things that we want is acceptance, right? Again, this is systems based. It's largely contextual. We want to be accepted by our friends. We want to be accepted by our communities. We want to be accepted by our classmates. We want to be accepted by our significant others, right? So we're looking to be accepted in different ways. And finding acceptance in the various systems that we pass through is very important to us. Autonomy, right, and individuality, that's something that's very important to us as well. One of the things that you might have noticed when you went away to college that has been significantly different, right, for those of you who might be dorming, or even if you're not dorming, if you moved into an apartment, or, just the college experience in general, that might be different than when you were in high school, right, is that you're largely on your own, right? You're for the first time having to pay some of your own bills. You're able to maybe make your room the way that you want to make your room, right? Even the idea of you having to identify a major, right, is different than in high school when you were given a set of classes that you just have to be in. Right now, you have to determine what path do I want to take. Right, this kind of goes hand in hand with this concept about my perspective, my experience. So that's what we want. We want to be our own person. We want to pursue individuality. Does that make sense? The next thing we want is stimulation, right? So there's physical stimulation, mental stimulation, spiritual stimulation. So we're looking for stimulation in different areas of our life. And again, subjective, right? So you always have to look at this through that subjective context. So when we're thinking about stimulation, some people find watching a scary movie very stimulating. Some people couldn't care less of watching such a movie, right? Some people like going to amusement parks. Some people think that amusement parks are boring, So stimulation is its own variable, and how it is satisfied, it's largely determined on the person. Lastly, what we want is safety, right? We want physical safety from hurt, harm, or danger, right? And the goal of these 6 motivators is that we want all of them to be fulfilled, right? That's what we're largely trying to do, is trying to have all 6 of these fulfilled in whatever way that we're looking to fulfill them, right? One of the dilemmas that we face in life is when we're trying to fulfill one, it might interfere with the other one's satisfaction, right? So for example, a dilemma that is very common in high school is the desire to be accepted, right? That might be something that you guys are going through in college as well. You want to be accepted, but you want to be accepted for your individuality, right? If you're not accepted for your individuality, then you're just going to do a set of behaviors that will allow you to be accepted by any crowd, right? So you'll be part of this group and not really feel seen, right? Because your individuality is not recognized. The problem also could be that you're too individualistic, right? The things that you want are too unique, and you don't find a group that aligns with that, which can make you feel isolated and alone, right? Which is its own feelings that can come about when that happens. We give some things value, right? We want to be valued for certain things, but the things that we look to value could compromise our safety, right? So all six, the goal is trying to juggle all six of these while not trying to put the other in harm's way. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Can I keep going? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So now that we kind of understand when we're thinking of what our mental health is, even though we had the definition, that working definition of a person's condition with regard to their psychological and emotional well-being, a simple way of looking at it is the satisfaction of our needs and wants, right? If our needs and wants are being satisfied, our mental health is going to be in good standing. If our needs and wants are not satisfied, our mental health is going to most likely be in poor standing. Does that make sense? All right, so let's look at what emotions are, right? So an emotion is a strong feeling deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others, right? So that's kind of our simple definition of it, or complex definition rather of it. When we try to simplify that definition of, what an emotion is, it is the states of regulation or dysregulation that comes from the satisfaction or lack thereof of the emotional minds being met, right? So when we think of those six motivators, we can just consider this our emotional mind, right? Having these six met, these needs met, is our emotional mind being satisfied. So if they're not being met, you're going to have an emotion. If they are being met, you're going to have a feeling. Yes, Casey?
Emily has a good question.
Yes, I do have a quick question. So I
Mhm.
wanted to ask about, like, you were talking a bit about if our needs and our wants are not met, that can affect our mental health. Does there need to be a balance between like what do we need versus what we want, or does like what we need quantify more towards our mental health than like what things we want? Like which one is a priority?
That's a good question. I often talk about needs and wants as separate, but a lot of the times you can kind of house them under the same umbrella because sometimes we're quick to dismissing our wants and saying that there are things that have to be met, that should be met objectively, right? Where in reality, there are some wants that can really be needs, right? So if you're talking about, is it a need to I don't know, spend time with friends? Is that an absolute need that you have to do? You know what I mean? So other things might be seen as taking more precedent and priority, but in reality that satisfies your life. It makes your life worth fulfilling, and so you can look at that as a need. So I don't want it to be so easily written off as what's a need versus what's a want. There are some things that can take precedent. We can, when we reach the end, towards the end, I'm going to talk about that in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That can help us understand which needs tend to take precedent over the others. But what I often is misunderstood, even with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is that in some cases, some of those things should be seen as this is an absolute necessity for me. You know what I mean? It keeps my life fulfilled. Does that make sense? I know it doesn't really answer the question, but it kind of does.
Thank you. It does.
Okay. So, when we're thinking about emotions, again, if a need is being met, then we're going to have a feeling. If a need is not being met, we're going to have a feeling, right? So we can understand that an emotion is the state of being that we're in as our need is being met or as our need is not being met, right? Does that make sense? Um, Now, some of the feelings that we have in, even though an emotion is a present experience, a lot of the times emotions come because of an anticipated outcome, right? Or a reflected outcome. So when we think about things of the past, they can create a feeling in the now. When we think about things that might happen, they can create a feeling now, right? This is where anxiety comes from. Anxiety is an anticipatory feeling, right? It's our abstract minds is creating a world in which what is to come is kind of happening, right? So if I'm planning my events for Saturday, right, and I'm worried that it might rain, you know, I've already built an abstract world, right? Using that very rational part of our brain. They call it the prefrontal cortex. We use our very rational brain to create an abstract world in which I am doing that event, right? It's Saturday, and I am making my barbecue, and everything is there. But then it's going to rain, right? And the rain ruined the event, right? It has the potential, I'm sorry, of ruining the event. And so anxiety lights up in order to encourage me to do something in the now to prevent the outcome of the future from happening, right? When we think about regret, right, that feeling, if I am reflecting on my past experiences and it makes me feel regret, so I wanted a different outcome to happen, but I was unable to impact that outcome, and now I'm living with the outcome that is least desirable, it's going to create a feeling in the now as I reflect on that past scenario. Does that make sense? Okay. So, with that understanding, we can kind of look at the feelings wheel. Now, people have different ways of looking at this. I'm going to show you the way that I like looking at the feelings wheel. I like starting in the center. In the center, we look at the big feelings. It's important to understand our feelings because our feelings, again, tell us about what experience we're having. So when we're thinking about emotions like anxiety and depression, a lot of the times we look at them and we go, they're pathological, right? They have to be removed. This is where we introduce concepts like when we're talking about medicating, right? We're assuming that the situation is a matter of organicity, and we're trying to rid ourselves of the feeling, right? A lot of the times, not all the time, but a lot of the times, this is kind of the approach that we might have to some of these feelings, is that we have to rid ourselves of them. Where in reality, these feelings are telling us about something that relates to our 6 motivators, right? So if something is challenging my ability to be valued, I'm going to have a feeling, right? Maybe it might be anger, right? If somebody's disrespecting you, right? It will be anger, right? Now I'm frustrated because they've challenged my value, right? Or somebody's attacking something of value to me, right? Maybe I don't know, a pothole popped the wheel of my car, right? The car was something I've assigned value to, and now there's damage to it. So I'm going to have a feeling about that, right? That's why we have to kind of move away from looking at emotions in this pathological lens solely. And we can look at them as, okay, each one of these emotions are telling me about an experience that my perspective has, right? Does that make sense? So when we look at these feelings, if we start in the center, right, we can have a feel. I like to start in the center because these are where the big feelings are, right? And then we can start moving our way out to the more specific feeling that we're having, right? So when we're talking about a feeling like anger, you know what I mean? Anger is a guardian, right? So it's telling me that I want to protect. Maybe I want to protect myself. Maybe I want to protect someone else, right? It also tells me the story of powerlessness, right? Maybe someone is threatening me with powerlessness. They're telling me what I can't do, right? Maybe there's an injustice that's going on, you know what I mean? And I want that change, but something's in the way of that. I'm going to have anger, right? So we can't look at anger as pathological if we're thinking about it as the emotion needed for activists, you know, and the emotion needed for what you would do for your friends, or what your parents would do for you, right? If you're in harm's way. We look at sadness. Sadness tells me about a story of being isolated, of losing hope, you know. So just looking at these emotions, surprise, right, is a feeling of the unexpected. Joy, right, is kind of a feeling of the unexpected, but it's telling me about something that is encouraging jubilee, right? Love, right, it tells me it's this feeling of connection. It lets me know I'm in this world with someone else. So all of these feelings, they're purposeful, and so we can move away from this pathological lens when we start examining that these feelings have meaning. Now, where treatment, whether it be medication or certain kinds of therapy, is useful with these emotions, is when the feeling is so great that it becomes too dysregulating for the host, right? So if I'm dealing with anxiety, which is an anticipatory feeling, it's a state of alertness. It's not necessarily bad on its own, but it can be overwhelming, right? And if it becomes overwhelming, a lot of the times, and we'll get to that, it's because I don't know what action will satisfy this feeling, you know? Um, And until I can figure out what action can satisfy this feeling, even though the situation has not happened, I'm dealing with the dysregulatory feeling in the now, which is overwhelming my nervous system. Does that make sense? So emotions are, the compasses that inform us of our needs slash wants, and our needs and wants, when our needs and wants cannot be met, right? So when we're thinking about emotions, like I was mentioning to you, it is very perspective, right? It is very centered around me. A perspective is forged by our experiences. So our personal experiences create our perspectives, So if you maybe you grew up in a home that was very crowded, there was a lot of people there, right? So there's a perspective that you have, right? Where when you individuate, meaning when you leave the home, you might develop the perspective that a lot of people in the house, right? If that experience wasn't favorable, a lot of people in the home could be, it's a lot, right? And I don't want to deal with that anymore. So my experience now, my perspective, I'm sorry, when I leave the home is going to be to seek out situations where I'm not in a crowded, dynamic, right? But some people could have had a crowded dynamic and loved it, right? It was favorable. Everybody recognized your needs and wants. You were able to talk about your emotions. You didn't have to exert yourself to meet the needs of the other people in your family. And if that's the case, then you're going to want to be part of a big family, right? That's going to be your perspective. So when you individuate the home, you might look for large friend groups. You might look to be in relationships that lets you be very communal. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions so far? We're good. Want me to keep moving on? Okay. So, we can move to the conversation about EQ, right? This is something that's commonly talked about, when we talk about emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to manage both your own emotions and understand the emotions of the people around you. Now, what's nice is we've already established a working definition about what good mental health is and what an emotion is, right? So we understand that the ability to have your needs met, right, and the ability to recognize the needs of others, right, and do the appropriate action to meet their needs, that's going to be largely what emotional intelligence is centered around. Okay. So, emotions lead to needs being met, and it leads to needs, and needs leads to action, right? If we can understand this process, then we're going to have strong emotional intelligence. So recognizing your emotions. So going back, if we look at these feelings, understanding what feeling I'm having in a moment, that's the beginning of emotional intelligence. It's a strong introduction, but it's only the beginning, right? So, for example, if I'm dealing with the feeling of guilt, right? Guilt is a feeling that comes because I have distanced myself from my principle, right? So I've determined on a subjective level, right? Largely internalized, but on a subjective level, I've determined that something is wrong, right? Whether it be stealing, whether it be talking over a friend, right? Whatever the case might be, I've determined that there's something that is wrong, right? And that's what my principle was created around. Now, when I distance from that, my feeling of guilt comes in. The feeling, like we talked about, is not pathological. There's nothing wrong with the feeling of guilt. What we might want to re-examine is the principle that would encourage the guilt to come about, right? So when we're talking about, this introduction, right, to emotional intelligence, it's recognizing I'm having a feeling, right? After I understand the feeling, now I can move into the need. What need slash want is connected to that feeling? We just talked about guilt, and we're just talking about how guilt is connected to the principle. Okay, so I have a need for my understanding of a world that's just, a world that's fair, requires people not to steal, right? At least in this situation. And so because my perspective looks like this, that's why I'm having this feeling right now, right? Because the feeling would shift, right, if my perspective was different. If I saw that stealing was right, if I'm Robin Hood, right? I'm stealing from the wealthy and I'm giving it to the less fortunate, then I wouldn't feel guilty from stealing, right? So it's again largely subjective. Now, after we identify what the need is, the hardest part, the final piece to emotional intelligence is identifying what action satisfies that need, right? If I can figure out what action satisfies the need, right? And the key to this, I forgot to mention, is not just understanding what action satisfies the need, but to what level of okayness that action has to be performed to satisfy that need, right? So if I'm saying I'm bored right now, I want to be stimulated, right? That's one of the 6 motivators that we looked at. I'm bored right now, I want to be stimulated. So what do I do to find stimulation? Maybe I watch TV and I want to binge watch my favorite television show, right? So I turn on the TV, I turn on Mighty Morphing Power Rangers, and I want to watch 777 episodes of that show, right? That might be a little bit much. It's going to satisfy the need, but it might be too much of an action that I can do right now in order to satisfy the need, right? Because we don't want to overindulge. Overindulgence can put someone else's well-beings in harm's way, or it can delay us from getting our needs met in a realistic way consistently, right? Because if I watch all 700 episodes of a particular TV show, then perhaps there's no episodes left, right? Or if I really want the cake and I eat the whole cake for myself, right, then maybe my roommates or my friends won't be able to partake in eating the cake, right? And so that puts me in one of the other motivators in harm's way, because how am I protecting the people that I say are valuable to me, right, if I'm doing this action that puts their well-being in harm's way? So we really want to ask ourselves, what actions, to what level of okayness can our action be done to meet the need? And if we do that action correctly, if we can identify that action and do that action correctly, then we'll notice a response on an emotional level that displays that happened, right? That everything was okay with that action. Does that make sense? Any questions so far before I keep going? Okay, so we understand what mental health is. We've had some conversation about emotions. We looked at EQ. Now we can actually start talking about what stress is, right? Stress, again, is one of those feelings that has a bad reputation. When we think of stress, we don't think of it favorably. In fact, they even made a definition for a separate kind of stress. They call eustress, EU-stress, right? That says this is the good stress. But we don't want to make it so simplistic and binary where there's good and bad stress, right? Again, stress is subjective. So what is stress about? Stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances, right? So what is the purpose of this dysregulatory feeling? Stress is used in order to have a need met. We use stress in order to encourage ourselves to meet a need, right? So if we go back to those 6 motivators, right? And we're looking at these and we say that I want one of these things met. The operation to have those things met is going to require stress. Does that make sense? So if I want to be accepted, right, this is my one chance to be accepted, right? Maybe I'm going to a school function, right? And you know, all the people are going to be there, all the who's and the whatnots of the school are all going to be in this one function, and I have one opportunity to prove to all of them that I deserve to be here, right? Maybe I have to do a class presentation, and this is everything. My entire grade rides on this presentation. So I really have to perform very well for this presentation, or I have a paper that's due, right? And the paper, I only have a few hours left, right? Because I waited to the last minute, because that's on me and I'm lazy. And I thought that would be the best time to do the paper. I waited to the last minute, and that's when I'm going to do it. It's going to require stress to do all of those performances, right? So now a feeling comes inside, right, that is encouraging me to perform so I succeed in this task. We know it's subjective as an emotion or a state of being, because if I don't really care about school, right, if I don't see its purpose, then I'm not going to feel stress with a paper, right? If I don't really care about my job, right, and I'm showing up late for work, I'm not really going to care about the outcome, right? And so stress won't come about. You see, from those experiences, they're largely based on my psyche, right, which is subjective. once again. Does this make sense so far? So when we think about stress and we think about its purpose, again, it's to help with performance. Stress comes in order to have me meet a need, right? So what are the need what are the need of ground what is the need rather of grounding coping skills as it relates to our mental health? What is the need of grounding and coping skills? When we're thinking about grounding and coping skills, what they help us, if you want to think of it like a threshold, right? And we're having a feeling. Feelings have to remain in our window of tolerance. If they are over, if they're going over our window of tolerance, they're going to become too dysregulatory for me to manage, right? So there is a healthy amount of stress, that's needed. I do want to perform well, right? If I'm an athlete, right, and I'm playing for the big game, I do want my muscles to operate at their prime, right? And stress allows me to do that. If I'm on a debate team and I'm in the midst of a debate, I do want to be mentally acute, and stress will help me do that, right? If I'm presenting and I want to be alert, right, I do want the ability to recognize the faces and the energy in the room, and stress will help me do that. So there is a healthy amount of stress, right? I could say the same for anxiety. I could say the same for anger. I could say the same for sadness. All emotions are needed, right? But when they go overboard, when it's too much, right? When an activity is too stimulating, right? Or even understimulating, and I'm starting to go beyond my window of tolerance. Now we're talking about dysregulation. Now we have to figure out how can we find methods to regulate this in this dysregulation that's going on in my body. That's where grounding and coping skills come in. They both have their own purpose, right? So when you're thinking about a grounding skill, right? I like to say that coping skills naturally embody grounding skills. But when you're thinking about a grounding skill is the use of my senses, right? My five senses in order to bring my mind back to a state of regulation, right? Realistically, my entire body. When we think of emotions, we usually think of them as this very abstract thing. But in reality, an emotion is the processing of sensations that are occurring in my body, right? Most specifically through my nervous system, right? So my sympathetic nerves and my parasympathetic nerves are connected to different muscle groups in my body. When I'm going through an experience, right, and my perception, my five senses tells me I'm in danger, they call this neuroception, or they're picking up on something that I have to be alert about, then they're going to send a message, right, through neurotransmitters. They're going to send a message to muscle groups in my body, right? That's why when, I'm having a feeling, I can feel it in my gut, my heart rate increases, my shoulders get tense, right? My hands get clammy, my mouth gets dry. These are all displays of emotions that I'm processing in my body in real time, right? So when we're understanding, the reason that we have to understand this is because when we're saying, well, what's the purpose of a grounding skill? And we say that a grounding and a coping skill is to regulate me. Well, how do they do that? My grounding skill is supposed to teach my body, right, in lifetime that I'm safe, right? That whatever nervous response I'm having, it's not necessary, right? So the nervous response varies, but the easiest way to look at nervous responses is to look at the 4 Fs, right? In a sympathetic response: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? So a fight response is my desire to tackle the threat, right? My freeze response is the operation of shutting down, right, as a threat is presented to me. My fawn response is my desire to appease a threat desperately, right? If you ever be in the TSA and they yell at you to put your shoes in the basket, and you say, okay, I'm sorry. That's largely a fawn response. Fight, fright, freeze, and flight response is the one I missed. A flight response is the desire to get away from the threat, right? So that's usually where a lot of the high energy emotions come from, the ones that produce a lot of stress. Then there are the shutting down, right? They sometimes call this the scientific word of this is the dorsavagal, but it's this shutdown response that's happening from intense parasympathetic response. So you ever been in class and you just dissociate and your mind goes elsewhere, right? Sometimes what's being presented, the information that's being presented to you is overly stimulating. So it's too much information, or it's not being presented to you in a method that is favorable to you. So your mind goes elsewhere because it's saying, I want to protect you from the situation that you're in. And that's a form of shutting down, right? It can even happen in arguments, right? You ever been in an argument with a person and you just shut down and you can't use words, right? That portion of your brain, the prefrontal that we talked about earlier, that's where language is largely kept. And if a situation is too triggering, your brain shuts down, right? And you can't access that region of your brain anymore. So biologically, you cannot articulate your words, right? To mount a counter argument, you know? So when we're thinking of the purpose of a grounding skill, it is to get me out of these dysregulated states, right? Whether my sympathetic response is too heightened or my parasympathetic is too heightened, right? And if we know that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are supposed to balance each other out, when we're thinking of a grounding skill, we have to find an activity that we can do right now using our 5 senses that's going to encourage the activation of the one that's not dysregulated, right? The one that's not overactive, more specifically. So I need something that might have to activate my parasympathetic, right? So breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, right? That's a good grounding skill because what it does is it brings balance from with your nervous system in your sympathetic and parasympathetic. Does that make sense? Big breaths out, right? Exhalation, big breaths out. That's the one that helps with parasympathetic. Breaths in, that's the one that helps with sympathetic, right? So depending on how you are dysregulated, right, you can ask yourself, which one do I need in this moment? So I can do, they have 6 seconds in, 4 seconds out, or 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, right? Depending on the situation that I'm in. So that's a grounding skill. So using my senses, it could be touching an object that's very smooth. It could be rubbing my fingertips together. It could be naming 5 things that are in my vicinity. It could be using my hearing and closing my eyes, I could put an icy object on the back of my neck, right? Because all of these things produce sensation, and it's teaching my mind to connect to that sensation. And if that sensation isn't jarring, if it's soothing, then it would help me from a sympathetic response. And if I need to find activation, then I need a sympathetic thing. Maybe clapping my hands, right? If I'm, zoning off in class, or, having a conversation with a friend, right? If I'm in a meeting, and I just I drift off because the meeting was too dysregulating. So that's what grounding skills are. Coping skills are activities that we do in our lives that can produce well-being by also meeting needs. But they require some grounding element to them because they have to be activities you enjoy, right? It's not a good coping skill if it just dysregulates you and that's the end of it. It's a good coping skill if it activates your nervous system in a particular way, right? Captures your attention, and helps you ultimately regulate. So, for example, for some people whose life is very busy and stressful, yoga is a good coping skill, right? Because like we just talked about with that counterbalance effect, it is giving you an intense parasympathetic response, right? If it's mindful, right? And for some people, a good coping skill might be something that is movement-based, right? Like basketball or running, right? Because it gives you, if you have a life where you sit in the chair all day and you don't really do much, it'll give you the counterbalance. It'll give you something that's active and really challenge your brain. Or for some people, it's reading a good book because it drifts you off into some world, right? That's not your right now. And that could be very soothing to you. Does that make sense? All right. So we talked about we addressed mental health, we addressed emotions, we've addressed EQ, we've addressed stress, we've addressed the difference between grounding and coping. Before we get to the last 2, I want to check in again. How's everybody doing? Any questions? Okay. So the last 2, what is a community? right? Now, it's important to understand community and their needs in our lives, right? Because community essentially is a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals, right? That's a nice definition, but now that we're seeing the six, we ask ourselves, how does community benefit this aspect of the six, right? Well, we know that our brains are hardwired for connection. We need connection, right? And so we're always going to be seeking it, you know? But the danger in connection is the right kinds of connections, right? Because if we find, I'm sorry, the wrong kinds of connections, because if we find the wrong kinds of connections, this can actually damage our brain. This is where trauma comes from, you know? So if we're thinking about the six motivators again, and we're saying, I want to be connected because value is important to me. And I can't, valuing yourself is good, right? But realistically, it's difficult to consistently value yourself without moving into narcissism, right? So we want value in our lives. And so we need to be in certain groupings of people who will value us, right? But we don't want it to be so hard to get access to that value, right? Maybe we have some friends that you can only get value from doing 107 things for them. And then at the 107th thing, they say, thank you. This is going to largely dysregulate you in an effort to, like we just talked about with stress. If I'm trying to get this value, I'm going to do a lot of things in order to get value. I'm going to be, I'm going to have a lot of anxiety wondering, did this person value me or not? Right. And this could put me in harm's way. Right. So we want to make the right kinds of connections of people who are going to offer us value, interests very easily, and we don't have to work extremely hard in order to get these things. In addition, when we're thinking about community, they can help us in accomplishing our needs, right? And not just our needs in the sense of providing value, but our goals, right? Because goals are very important. They're part of having a well a well-established life, right? Is creating goals and accomplishing goals. This is what builds confidence, right? And confidence allows us to tackle larger goals, and we keep doing that. Now, there's a reward every time we accomplish a goal. We have a dopaminergic response every time we accomplish a goal. And a simple way of understanding dopamine, right? Which many of you who are pre-med students are already studying, right? It's just the communication of neurons, right? A neurotransmitter allows neurons to have a connection and talk to each other, right? And so when we do an activity that is rewarding, right, that's satisfactory to us, our system goes off, right? And we get a little reward of dopamine. And so we keep doing this, right? And we keep getting larger and larger rewards. But we also have fear. Fear will keep us from trying something, right, that might have a lot of dopaminergic response, right? But it's too much for us to try that, right? So I might not feel confident in asking for the promotion, right? Or I might not feel confident in, trying to try out for a particular play or a particular play in if I'm thinking of a sport, a particular role in a sport, I might not feel confident in doing that if I've not had a history of successes, right? That's what confidence is all about, right? So one of the reasons that we have community are these are people that when we go through bad experiences, they can help us reframe those experiences so we don't let them beat us down, right? If, I tried out for the play and it didn't work, if I wanted to try out for a particular sport and I got cut, you know what I mean? The fact that I don't give up and never try again, which is our brain's way of trying to protect us from failure because of the feeling that we get when we fail. We can go to a good community and the community will encourage us, right? They're also good for networking, right? And help us get particular jobs or, they might tell us about particular professors that are favorable, does that make sense so far? All right, so we have a big need for community. If we want to look at the idea of co-regulation, we can put it that way. Community is the best way of helping us co-regulate, right? Helping us manage our dysregulatory states, So the final thing that we want to look at, right, when we're thinking about mental health is climbing the pyramid, right? So we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe some of you saw this in your introduction to psych classes or your sociology classes, but we have different needs. Our goal is to get here, self-actualize, right? All of these things that we talked about today culminate in helping us do this. So first we have to meet our physiological needs. Once we're at a place where we can meet our basic needs, eat, sleep, clothing, doing all of these things, once we're able to meet these physiological needs, right? And if we're having trouble meeting them, sometimes we don't know when we're hungry, right? Sometimes when we don't know when it's the appropriate time to rest. We have to figure out how to meet these things, so that we can keep moving up the ladder, right? Or pyramid. And our goal is to get here, self-actualize. And so we need connection, we need community, right? We need healthy coping skills so that we can regulate from failed attempts at connection with community, from failed attempts at meeting other needs that we might have, right? So we need coping skills, we need grounding skills so that we can keep moving up. And we'll find our esteem, right? This is where our confidence comes from. We're able to recognize what we're capable of, and we have hope in trying something that might seem difficult to others, right? And then we conclude here where we've manifested the life that we want, right? That's ultimately how we have a healthy well-being, right? Is manifesting the life that we want, but also being able to pivot, right? When we need to, because sometimes the life that we want might not be possible, right? Maybe the life that we want, sometimes with more information, we realize it's not good for us, right? Or maybe our skills are better served in another area, and we don't find that out until much later, right? Maybe some of you started out in one particular major and found that I'm not interested, or maybe this major is just difficult for me to comprehend because of the way that I learn, and there's not an opportunity to learn in this particular way. So I might need to pivot. My adaptability and ability to, meaning my ability to shift my lens in terms of goals, right? Reprioritize when necessary, take on a new task, right? If the old task is dangerous or is not favorable for my well-being or the well-being of those I care about, that's also going to be very important in me self-actualizing a life that is very meaningful to me, right? As well as making a life where I build very meaningful connections. Does that all make sense? Any questions?
We have a list of questions from all of our board members, and Karen, our events manager, will be facilitating it.
Okay.
Okay. My name's Karen. Just to give a brief introduction, I'm a freshman in bioengineering and I am the event coordinator. So now I'm gonna get into the first question. So what led you into this career and what has made it so rewarding?
What led me into this career? I really like helping people, and I just wanted to find a way that I can do it while also engaging something that interests me a lot. And so psych is something that's very interesting to me, and that's the thing that led me to being a psychotherapist.
And what are some ways that have made it rewarding over time?
Oh, when you see your patients accomplishing, reaching self-actualizing, like we talked about, and knowing that you are a small part of that, that's very rewarding to me.
And then, in your experience, what are some of the most significant factors contributing to the increase in mental health issues, specifically among young adults and college students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So could you repeat that one more time?
In your experience, what are some of the most significant factors contributing to the increase in mental health issues, specifically among young adults and college students?
Okay. You can look at this from two angles, right? My degree is in social work, so we largely look at problems at a systems level, right? So when you're asking the question about, well, what stressors, what things have led to a challenge in mental health among, you said, young adults and
Mhm.
college level students, we have to look at systems, right? So if we're talking about young adults, we can talk about just the different needs to adulting, right, that come about, right? Because we're trying to pursue this, we're trying to have these 6 things met. And now there's a whole bunch of things in the way of that, right? Because I want safety, right? So I want a home. I just want to be able to live somewhere, and I want that place to be comfortable for me. Okay, if I'm going to pursue that, I'm going to need a job, right? Now I have to go into the job market, and there's a lot of challenges that come with that, you know. Sometimes I don't get the job that I want. Sometimes I got the job that I want, but I don't maybe the salary isn't the salary that I wanted it to be at, right? Maybe inflation just keeps mounting and I can't keep up with it. You know what I mean? So these are some of the challenges that, as well as global affairs, affairs that are happening in my community. These are the things that can challenge me on a system level as a young adult. As a college student, right? Many of you have classes that you have to do well in, right? And the structure of school is highly performance based, right? If you don't do well, that's going to be problematic. Ultimately, it can lead you to getting expelled from school. You might have a delay in your ability to meet your goal, and that's going to ultimately challenge your self-reflection of you, right? So this is something that could be challenging, or just college loans, as an example. These are the different things that challenge us in these larger groups, right? But then we can break it down to the individual, and we have different experiences in life, right? Maybe we were pursuing connection, and that connection didn't go well. Maybe the person we were dealing with was a bit narcissistic, or did not care for my well-being, and that was a bit traumatic an experience to go through, right? Maybe I came from a particular kind of home where they didn't acknowledge my needs, or they didn't teach me how to meet my needs myself, and that can lead me to having poor self-confidence, or just having all of these dysregulating emotions, but not knowing what to do to resolve them. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then kind of like reflecting on everything you've said and kind of the challenges people face as college students and young adults, what are some steps we can take to be more mindful of our mental health and develop effective coping mechanisms?
What are some steps we can take to be more mindful of our mental health? Well, things like this, I think, is really good. We have to be a bit assertive in creating opportunities to learn about how we can take care of our mental health. For a large amount of time, mental health was not really something that we examined or considered important. And like this group is named, right? It's this invisible illness, right? We're not understanding that a person psyche can be challenged from the stressors that they go through, right? And that can impact how they engage life, right? A lot of the sciences that have been built around mental health are fairly new, and so they're still babies compared to the other sciences when you're thinking of just biology and neurobiology and all of those sciences. They've had a longer time period of being studied and examined and learned about. So we have to be very diligent and push for more opportunities to learn about mental health and its importance. We need to create more jobs in therapy, where you have providers who can provide care for people and help them in their circumstances. We have to be nicer to each other, right? That's going to also give us opportunities to have a better well-being overall. But that's how we do it.
And then what are the proper statements to say to someone who is suffering from an invisible illness?
What are the proper statements to say to someone who's suffering from an invisible illness? It's there's a number of ways we can talk about it, but one of the more important things is our intentionality, right? When we're dealing with a person who's dealing with an invisible illness, on some level, then, well, one, if you don't see it, then you might not be cognizant to even do something about it. But if you are knowledgeable of it and you want to just treat them more favorably, a good a practice to do is just asking a person how they'd like to be treated, you know? Because if we go around presuming what actions or what things that we say to make them feel safe. What we do could actually cause them harm if we don't realize that. And we want to create a world that is catering to everyone's individuality. So you do want to get in the habit of saying, is it okay if I identify you as this? Is it okay if I call you that? Is it okay if I give you this nickname or that nickname, right? Learn what's comfortable for the person, that will be a good way of doing this.
Mhm. And then when a gold standard technique in therapy, such as ERP, seems to not be working to alleviate a patient's anxiety, and if traditional anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications are not working, what are some other approaches a psychotherapist can take to provide successful care for their patient?
So ERP is largely centered around those two concepts, exposure and reduction, right? And so the idea behind it's a cognitive behavioral approach, and the idea behind it is I'm going to expose you to something that's going to create dysregulation in your system. Now, with that dysregulation, we have to practice bringing that response down, right? That's where the grounding skills and the coping skills we were talking about earlier comes into effect. So when you're saying that, well, why is this approach not working? And what can we do when we're trying to solve it? Sometimes what happens in therapy or in treatment in general is we can approach it very clinically, right? And we lose sight of the person. So, if we see a response that a person's having and we say, you shouldn't have that response, right? Let's practice dropping it. What we're not asking is, why do you have that response, right? This is where we have to be a little bit more analytical in our approach and examine, okay, what is creating this response? Sometimes people just need to be validated in their experience, right? So sometimes people have fear and they need their fear validated before you tell them, here's what you do to stop feeling afraid. Or sometimes people are feeling sad and that need that sadness validated before you tell them, here are a set of things you can do to stop feeling so sad, you know? So a lot of the times when those approaches don't work, it's because we are not validating, we're not understanding that person's subjective experience and validating that. And the other part of that question was what again?
I guess I feel like you answered it pretty well, just when like traditional like therapy methods like ERP or medication aren't working, like what are some
Mhm.
ways a psychotherapist can like care for their patient?
Yeah, and the only thing I would say is for the medication portion, um, medication is supposed to operate on an organic, it's supposed to have a matter of organicity. So if I take medication, if I keep increasing the dosage, there should be a reduction in symptomologies, right? Um, if it's not doing that, that means that I'm not addressing the problem, right? If the problem is perspective based, and it goes back to that validation, I need to identify how are you perceiving events, right? That is leading you to have such a dysregulated response. And I have to work with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And
Mhm.
then I guess for our last question, how can we support Black people's mental health in the midst of a shortage of Black psychotherapists and psychotherapists?
We need there needs to be more of an encouragement for people who Black individuals, but everybody in minority groups to move into a mental health space, right? Which means that we as a macro system have to be more permissive for psychotherapy and counseling practices to be something that floods the job market essentially, right? Because realistically, these are professions, right? And if they're not valued in any way, right? If they're not given the appropriate salaries or given the right level of demand, so they're not too demanding, you know what I mean? A lot of people just won't go into those fields, right? So people will tend to go into fields that you can find financial gain in. People will go into fields that are not too overwhelming in stress. You know what I mean? That can help satisfy extrinsic motivators, not just intrinsic ones. So they need to be valued to encourage more people of more Black people to enter into the field, but also there needs to be more information given out about those who are already in the field and how you can get services from them. A lot of people don't know where to find people of color when they're looking for therapists, and there are a lot of referral programs and institutes that make it their responsibility to give this information out. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
I would like to open it up if anyone else here in this meeting has any questions.
So earlier on, you talked about like prioritizing or balancing like needs and wants and approaching like our needs in realistic ways. So how do we go about like realistically meeting our needs and not like either overindulging or like under meeting those needs?
Well, how do we go? It largely depends on what the need is and its relation to the systems we inhabit, right? So, if my need exhausts the resources of the systems I inhabit, if my needs exhaust the other people in the systems I inhabit, that's where it can become problematic. So, for example, I need to be validated, right? That's important. Somebody telling me that, giving me that kind of validation. Now, if I'm asking a friend or I'm asking, a significant other, to validate me, every hour on the hour, you know what I mean? There's nothing wrong for wanting that. The problem is in its practice, right? Because now you're going to be exhausting, another person, right? Because, it could be too much for them. So I want to check in with them. Is that too much, right? And if the answer is yes, and I want to be with this person, right? Then I have to find a good balance that would be satisfactory for me, right? Maybe I need to delegate that need between others, right? Maybe I have other friends that I can call up, and seek out validation. Stimulation is the same thing. I have a desire to be stimulated, but maybe I shouldn't be doing parkour. Maybe there's another way that I can get my heart rate racing, right? And it could be a little bit safer, so we really want to think about the systems we inhabit. We want to think about our own well-being ultimately, right? But this is how we do that. But I want you to not go in the habit of saying this need is too much, right? Right, without testing it with the system, right? Is it too much, right? Maybe they do have seconds at the buffet, and so you can go get, 2 more plates. That's fine, right? Maybe it's okay if you do ask friend, how's my outfit for the 3rd time in the day, right? If the system's okay with it, then it's okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you.
No problem.
I guess to add on to that, then is it also to like as a system, do you need to consider yourself as well? Like going back to the example, you're gonna go to the buffet table and get 2 more slices of cake. But what if you can't afford to get 2 more slices of cake because of
Right.
like
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But that goes into examining my well-being, right? You don't want to put yourself in harm's way. So yes, if we go back to the hierarchies period, physiological needs are necessary. If the buffet says you're actually being charged every time you go up, right, and you don't want to exhaust your resources, then don't do that because you do have other needs that need to be met, right? That requires money, you know.
thank you.
No problem.
Do we have any other questions? You wanna, I think it might like reverb, so.
Hi, I have a really specific question. I was
Sure.
wondering if you ever read the book The Power of Now.
No, I've never read that book.
Have you heard of it though, or
The
no?
Power of Now. What's it?
Okay, 'cause it's like about emotional connection and like talking about being your present self and like
Mm,
worrying about anxiety and fear. But like, I was just wondering if you read it and if you had an opinion on it because it has to do with like your emotions as a person, but like also your conscience. So I was just wondering.
your conscience in general. You mean being
Yeah.
conscientious of your emotions, or having a conscience in relation to being in a people.
It's a difficult book to read, I definitely think, but I think it's more
Uh,
of like being conscious of like who you are now and like I guess like your past, like it's in the past, it doesn't define you type of a thing. So
No, no, no. I would agree with those sentiments for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you.
no problem.
Have any other questions? Does anyone online have any questions?
Nope.
All right. If not, thank you all for joining our meeting today, and thank you, Joel, for coming in and talking to us. It was a very informative and inspiring talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.